Get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid, the most awesomest homesteading channel on the internet that has nothing to do with homesteading. Can you believe that we are at the end of October? My, it's gone by so fast. All right, so we're going to get on with another... we're going to read another story for October Nights. This time from October Nights, Part 2. 31 more tales for the Halloween season. Okay, this is a special story to me. Hopefully it will be to you. It's called I Told You So. Originally titled Daffodils and Strawberry Hill. All right. I have a fire going in the wood stove down there at the house, and the smoke is making me a bit snotty. So get the old... There's something back there in the woods. Did you hear that strange howl? Yeah, you make sure to get my 6. You never know who or what may or may not show up in the backdrop of these videos. All right. With no further ado, as my beautiful bride Dearly would say, aka Giggly Girl, on with the story. Let's do it. The events I'm about to relate did not take place in October, though you'll no doubt agree, after hearing of these events, that this story is definitely fitting to be part of a collection of stories centered around Halloween. They happened in March. Actually, the events occurred during several different Marches over a period of several different years until the events stopped. The final March during which the events associated with this story took place last March. I'd gotten up in the middle of a particularly cold night to put another log on the fire in the wood stove and to use the restroom. I'd done both, and as I turned to leave the bathroom and go back to bed, she was there, standing just outside of the doorway. I told you so was all she said, and then, as mysteriously as she'd appeared, she'd vanished. She was not my wife, who was still in bed sleeping at the time. It was Angela. I went back to bed, still half asleep, thinking it had only been a dream. I woke up the next morning, and after carrying out my typical morning routine of coffee, quiet time, meditation, and breakfast, I went to my office upstairs and sat down at my desk. I peered out the window into our front yard, and there, for the first time that year, I saw them. Daffodils. They were in bloom now, and I remembered the apparition from the night before, and I remembered Angela, and I now realized it had not been a dream. I will now relate the entire story. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was about 7 years old the morning I walked into the church in the small town I grew up in. Old Lady Buxton was sitting toward the front of the church, crying, and everyone else from the congregation who'd already arrived for church service that day were sitting with her, consoling her. Everyone else except the kids, of course. They were all sitting in the back, trying not to make too much noise, just like every Sunday. I joined them, and once I got there, I pulled out the Matchbox cars I'd sneaked into church to help me pass the most boring, grueling 2 hours of my week. Will you marry me? It was Angela, one of the little girls I had attended church with, gone to school with, and had known basically my whole life. She had asked me this question while extending a handful of daffodils she'd apparently plucked from the yard in front of the church before coming in. Angela was always a sweetheart, but I was more concerned with my Matchbox cars at the time. What 7-year-old boy wouldn't be? I took the flowers, smelled them, and then I handed them back to her and I said, I don't want to marry you, but I'll always be your friend. She put her head down and mumbled, can't blame me for trying. I handed her one of my Matchbox cars and said, cheer up, and then we continued playing as if the proposal and the rejection had never occurred. We'd been playing with our cars and the other toys the other kids had brought for a few minutes when I noticed that Angela had stopped playing. I looked over at her and she was gazing toward Mrs. Buxton and the crowd around her. What is it? I asked. Old man Buxton, she said. He just walked in and sat down beside old woman Buxton, and she's acting like he's not even there. All of them are. I followed Angela's gaze with my eyes. I did not see Mr. Buxton, and I told Angela so. How can you not see him? She said. He's right there. I looked again, and as before, I could not see him. The preacher started his god-awful long sermon just a minute or two later, and he started by saying that he was sorry to state that we'd lost a member of our congregation, as just the night before, old man Buxton had died. I looked over at Angela. She had not heard the preacher because she'd been too caught up in building a ramp of sorts, using the hymnal books from the rack on the back of the pew in front of us, and rolling the Matchbox car I'd given her to play with down the ramp. I looked over at Mrs. Buxton and the crowd around her again, and old man Buxton was not there. Fast forward 15 years or so. I was attending a small state college in Appalachia. It turns out that Angela was attending the same college. I guess I'd known this for the previous few years we'd both been attending said college, but I hadn't fully acknowledged this fact until Angela and I would end up working on the student paper staff together. I as a sports writer and sports editor, and she as a columnist and junior editor for the paper senior year. Well, her senior year and my second senior year, I had a few senior years. My, how Angela had grown. Though we continued to associate with each other to a degree throughout our school years before college, we'd always been part of different cliques. I'd been a jock type, excelling in sports. She had been a nerdy girl, excelling in academics. Angela and I became not so much reacquainted with each other working on the college paper together, as we'd never really fallen out of touch with each other. We'd become more acquainted because for the first time since those early years in church, we were in close contact with each other on a more regular basis. I lived in a ratty apartment off campus, and Angela lived in the dorms. She would come down and hang out with me at the apartment sometimes, and we'd always go across the street to the convenience store and buy a bottle of Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine. At least that's what they call it, wine. Any true wine drinker would tell you that it's an insult to their beverage of choice, but hey, it was wet, it had alcohol in it, and it was cheap. We were college students, remember? But most importantly, we bought it regularly because it was Angela's favorite. One afternoon in March, Angela and I were sitting in my backyard, drinking a bottle of Strawberry Hill and talking about the paper. At least she was talking about the paper. I wasn't listening to a word she was saying. Rather, I was focusing on how she looked while she was saying them. Angela had transformed from that marginally cute little church girl nerd into one hell of an absolutely beautiful young woman. I'd noticed that the daffodils were up, so I said, "Excuse me a second." And I walked to the edge of the yard and I picked a few. I returned, sat down, and I handed them to Angela and I said, "Want to pretend we're married?" She took the flowers, smelled them, and then handed them back to me and said, "I don't want to pretend we're married, but I'll always be your friend." I took the flowers and I put my head down and mumbled, "Can't blame me for trying." She handed me the bottle of Strawberry Hill and said, "Cheer up." And then we continued drinking and talking as if the proposal and the rejection had never occurred. Our small school had an annual publication in which student writers would have their works of poetry, prose, and other short fiction stories published. Angela got several of her works published every year, and one of them was usually chosen to be the featured piece. I, on the other hand, never got published in the publication, even though I submitted several works to it every year. That year, Angela's last year in school, I asked the editor why I was never published in the annual. He told me, "Look, stick with sports or nonfiction. You're just not a good writer. Your stories don't make sense. They're not believable. There is no way anyone will ever read anything you ever write. You're just not any good." Literally millions of readers later, I just wrote his comments off as coming from someone who didn't like me. I wasn't a typical literature geek. I did not fit the mold. And the English lit professor, who was the faculty advisor for the annual, well, she just didn't like me either. At least that's what I told myself. I'd actually had her for class at some point, and she kicked me out for excessive absences and gave me an F. You see, her class was boring, and I wouldn't go unless there was a test. And when I went and took the test, I would always get an A, and it pissed her off, so the only way she could finally get rid of me and fail me was to do so due to my excessive absences. And when I'd gone to her and begged her to allow me back into the class, promising her I'd go to class, even though it was more boring than those extended church services I used to sit through when I'd been a little kid, she only became more angry toward me. She told me, much like the student editor, that I was not a good writer, give up, no one will ever read your work. If you actually think you'll be able to support yourself from writing someday, you're delusional. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual income years later, and no, the first number's not a 1 or a 2, and I'm going to stop right there or I will implicate myself. Kiddos of all ages, when people tell you you can't do something, you go out there and do it. Okay? They're telling you that because they're bitter and jaded because they didn't accomplish what they hoped to do, and they don't want to see you do it. I never got published in that annual, despite spending 2 more years at that little state college and submitting works of fiction I'd written both of those years. But fortunately, I never took the advice from the student editor or the faculty advisor either. And I'll point out at this time that I've taken the high road here, at least on my 5th round of edits on this work, before submitting it to my editor, and I have removed the 2 words that were originally written here. They were, fuck them, in case you're curious. It just always pays to take the high road and leave those nasty words out and just go on and make your $500,000 a year because millions of people watch your content, read your stories and all that stuff because you didn't listen to the dream killers. Brah. How do you do it? I asked Angela one evening while we were hanging out and drinking a bottle of, you guessed it, Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill. How do you write so good? You mean well, she said, laughing, showing off her lit geek prowess. She collected herself and said, have you ever noticed how real my stories seem? Yeah, I said. That's what I'm talking about. I mean, I know they're all about the paranormal and the supernatural, but when you read them, it's as if that stuff is all 100% real. How do you do that? You'd never believe me if I told you, she said. Try me, I said. I was desperate. I truly loved writing, and delusional or not, I wanted to do it full time. I have a third eye, Angela said, deadpan. You're joking, right? I said. Not at all, she said. You're nuts. There's no way that crap is real. Like, you're talking about seeing the future and all that? Seeing dead people everywhere? No way. I told you that you wouldn't believe me, she said. Okay, I said, prove it. Angela put her head down, thinking, okay. She said, you remember when we were kids that time in church when I said I saw Mr. Buxton come in to console his widow the morning after he died? Yeah, I said, but I just figured you were pranking me. I assumed that you and your family had already gotten word of his death. We hadn't, she said, and it wasn't a prank, it was real. That was one of the first times it happened. I'd later simply learned not to relay what I was seeing to others because I didn't want to get locked up in a nut house or forcefully medicated in the least. I'm not buying it, I said. You're very convincing, that's all. Angela put her head down again, thinking. I've got it, she said. I know how I can prove it to you. How, I said. Just make sure to outlive me, and when I die, I'll come back and tell you I told you so. With that, she jumped up laughing and turned around and said to me, remember, just don't die and I'll prove it to you. And then she ran off. She had a date with a man who she'd go on to marry and have 2 children with before ending up getting divorced in her mid-30s, like so many other people who would go on to marry college sweethearts only to get divorced in their mid-30s. That was one of the last times I saw Angela, as she would graduate only weeks later. She nor I went back to our small Appalachistanian hometown much, and we never ran into each other when we did. So her graduation, at which we never even spoke to each other, with all the people and the pomp and circumstance, etc., would be the last time I would ever see her. Until that night in March of last year, as of this writing, when I saw her standing just outside my bathroom door in the middle of the night she'd come to say, I told you so. After staring out my office window down at the daffodils in the front yard and having remembered all of these things from years ago, I decided to do a quick internet search for my old friend. I'm not a Facebooker. Well, I am now. Again. So I went straight to Google. I put in her name, and last I knew it to be after she'd gotten married. And I put in the name of the small town back in Appalachistan where I'd known her to reside, and that's how I found it. Her obituary. Angela had died only the week before. The end. Say, whoa, bittersweet, scary story. Like grapes on the vine, the strawberry wine, daffodils, college seniors and 5th year juniors, etc., etc. Hope you enjoyed that. I sure did. All right, two more days to go, folks. 2 more October nights, and then we're through. See you tomorrow for the next story.